Hello, everyone, and welcome to the future of space. I'm your host, Daniel Fox. Our guest today is Chris Hadfield. Chris is one of the most seasoned and accomplished astronauts in the world, and the first Canadian to walk in space. His Instagram account says he is a spaceship commander, TV host, public speaker, mustache aficionado, musician, professor, proud father, and loving husband. He is also a New York Times best-selling author. His latest book, The Apollo Murders, is a national and Amazon bestseller and listed as one of the best books of 2021. Chris, it is an honor to have you on the Future Space.
Thanks, Daniel. It's a real pleasure to be joining you, and thanks for all those accolades.
Well, I didn't write them all. Your profile account says all of it, so I'll give credit to you.
Yeah. All right.
Now, Chris, before we move on about your book and some of the work that you're doing recently, why don't we start about sharing with the audience three words that capture and really kind of summarize the space for you?
Three words. Uh, sure. Uh, Infinite, alluring, and dangerous.
And besides the obviously the science story and the technology story of going to space, what do you think is the human story of going to space? And would even push it as like the nature story of going to space.
It's fundamental human nature. Uh, all children leave home eventually, and it's been going on, for 300,000 years with our species, and that's never going to stop. And the only thing that's ever really limited it is our inventiveness and our, we didn't cross rivers until we invented rafts, and then we didn't cross mountains until we invented clothing and stored food, and we didn't cross oceans until we invented ships, and we didn't fly until we invented airplanes, and we didn't leave Earth until we invented rocket ships. But all of those things have been invented. They've allowed us to start to go exploring other places. It's fundamental human nature, and it's given us the richness and the understanding that we have as the, I don't know, the alpha species on this planet. And when you now build the capability to leave Earth, now there is an infinity of opportunity to explore and to maybe try and understand. So it's natural continuation of what we've always done, but just enabled within my lifetime by human invention.
I mean, that's the whole purpose of life, right? To go and push the boundaries and to seek new places. And just like you said, and I've written about that, how if we're not going to certain places, it's not because we don't want to, it's just because we can't until we do get to that place that we can. But life, it went from single cell to multi cell, and then it keeps pushing. And now the planet is about to go from single planet to multi planetary. And I think that the kind of evolution leap that we're going to see now that it's become multi-planetary is just going to be of a total new scale, would you say?
Well, we left Earth permanently 21 years ago by staying on the International Space Station as a species. People from 15 of the leading nations of the world have been exploring and experimenting and peacefully cohabitating on board a human outpost for an entire generation of life. That's unprecedented in our history. The space station is the biggest thing we've ever built off the planet, and it's running hundreds and hundreds of experiments every day. And so we're already kind of extra planetary. We have a small subset of us that don't live on Earth anymore, and the moon will be next. I'm not sure if the moon qualifies as interplanetary, but it's definitely somewhere besides Earth. And it's only 3 days away, so it's a natural first place as our technology gets good enough to start to settle. And then eventually we'll be able to cross that enormous ocean between us and Mars. But that's still far harder than most people think. But it's the natural progression. I mean, you left home, I left home. Uh, you have to. We can't, all stay in the same hut that we were born in, um, and that's what leads to invention and discovery and pushing people to the limits and the the necessity of invention is our innate nature. It's what's created so much of the richness of life and the opportunity for art and science. So going interplanetary, or at least extraplanetary, will only enrich in that and challenge people in new ways. One of the things, Daniel, that I'm really looking forward to is the art that comes from the new place. If you look at bluegrass music or jazz, those are imported music from somewhere else, but then coalesced and mixed and bubbled together in a new environment that then creates an entire new style of art form. And that's going to happen also. So yeah, so I think that that's the coolest part is what it does for us historically, for humanity, and all the opportunity that it opens.
I think art is really. I recently wrote about how space needed to focus a lot on creative storytelling and artists. I think one of the successes of the Renaissance was certain people that had a lot of capital and power, saw in artists their capacity to envision the future. And had it not been for the Medici, maybe the Leonardo da Vinci and all these great artists that we take for granted today had not existed. But art, I mean, is it fair to say that you were the first musician in space?
Oh no, there have been musicians in space since the very beginning. I mean, Yuri Gagarin played guitar. Not lots of people play, and there were harmonica players on some of the early, because you had to bring a tiny instrument on some of the very early American ships. When I went and helped build the Russian space station Mir back 26 years ago, um, gosh, 26 years ago, but there was a guitar up there, and it had been launched for previous space stations. When they had transferred the vital equipment from one of their old space stations to the new ones, they brought that St. Petersburg guitar across. So music always travels with us. Every sailing ship of adventure and discovery. Think about, hornpipes and all of the sea shanties and everything. That's because as we explore and leave home, music comes with us. And there's a cave above the Rhine where archaeologists were digging, and they found musical instruments from what they figure 42,000 years ago. Just hollowed out the leg bone, or the naturally hollow leg bone of a bird, that if you blow in one end, it whistles, and if you drill holes, can play it like a recorder. So music's been around longer than any written history. And it's nice that there's a guitar permanently up on the International Space Station. And I know from experience that it gets played almost every day by at least one member of the crew.
But not all of them gets 111 million views of the video and that's the really the power of art and music, combining these places to Earth. I mean, you covering David's song and you were playing it in space, and it created a language that was unifying about these two places, and that was art, becoming something bigger.
Yeah, I can describe something to you in words, and it kind of depends on your and my comprehension and use of the English language, and maybe the word choices that I make. Or I could paint you a picture of it, or perhaps I could make a sculpture of something for you, and you could look at that sculpture. But also, I could write music about it, and it may not even have words. But music is immensely evocative. Music is ancient, and it's try and go a whole day without any music at all in your life. I've played in many bands my whole life. I remember standing out once. We were playing a song that had a real strong beat, and I looked in a little one that had just learned to walk. Maybe 14 months, and that little one couldn't stand. They had to walk out, and they were moving with the music. They don't know anything about anything, but music got right into their very soul. And so it's another way maybe to try and explain the humanity of the spaceflight experience is to try and express it musically. And David Bowie was such a terrific artist. He never flew in space, but his song Space Oddity, my son changed some of the words to bring it up to date, and David Bowie was happy with that. But um, as you say, hundreds of millions of people have seen that video. And maybe then intuitively, intrinsically, they get a better feel for what space flight and being in space is actually like, which far supersedes my ability perhaps to just uh, describe it to them using mere words.
I was writing about how music is really our connection. I did this keynote presentation called "The Power of Nature," and I talk about how the rhythms are really important in life. You know, you have the rhythm of the days and nights, and then around the sun, and all these rhythms are creating disruptions. And music is really one. It's a rhythm that is disrupted by notes that creates the melody. So music is really kind of this fundamental connection to what life is, and the richness of it is that rhythm that is supported and embraced with all these disruptions, and that creates music. And that's why every time we hear it, we're just drawn back into this like essence of life.
I've had the experience of sitting with someone where we didn't share one word of a common language, on a train, but one of us has a guitar and just pass the guitar back and forth. You can make each other laugh,
Yeah.
and you can make each other cry just through the language of the music itself. And I know we had a band practice last night. In fact, a bunch of us. I knew a lot of the musicians, but I didn't know everybody because we're getting ready for a big stage show, and and the shared nature of creating music with people, it's not like anything else, and no one has ever quite done it this way before. And looking around inside the creative process of music is one of the things I like most in the world, because there's a level of connection and everyone can feel where the music's going to go next. What is this chord change going to be? How's this going to happen? What is the percussion or the rhythm section's going to do? And it's just a subset of life or a subset of human behavior, but it's a really precious one to me, and it's like no other.
Before we get into your book, I just want to ask you one more question about music. Were you a musician before you became a science or an astronaut? Or which one came first?
Well, we're all born musicians, just some of us have perhaps practiced more or learned more instruments or sing more, and everyone has varying skills, right? uh, you're probably not the best musician in the world. That might be one person. And you're not the worst musician in the world. You're just in the middle with everybody else. Everyone's a musician. I guess, though, we tend to not recognize someone as a musician until they can play an instrument or sing a song. And my brother and I bought our first guitar when I was about 9 or 10. We went to an auction sale, and my dad was off buying tractor parts. And at the household goods, they were holding up this old 6-string acoustic, and no one was bidding. And I was like goading my brother, and we had visions of being Elvis or something. And he, in a squeaky voice, he bid $5, and we had a guitar for $5. And that guitar wasn't even worth $5. It was terrible action, really hard on the hand. But that's the guitar we learned on. And then eventually we had enough skills and confidence to go buy a better guitar. In fact, it's behind me here now, a Yamaha FG 180. And I've had that guitar my whole life. Now I have a lot more guitars. So I guess my idea of becoming a musician was before I was 10. And then I actually started training with my brother, just the Mel Bay music method, and learning music as a kid. And then I played trombone in high school and in college and in stage band and marching band and jazz band and things. And so I guess I've been some sort of trained musician most of my life also. And then I've been a stage musician playing in, touring and festivals and pubs and weddings and everything else, most of my adult life as well. So none of that was going to stop when I got to the space station.
So when did that desire to leave, not to leave the music, but to really transition into the astronaut career, the training, becoming a pilot? Because they're pretty at the far end of the spectrum of direction. What happened for you to go there, or was it always something on the sideline that you wanted to pursue?
Yeah, hardly anyone gets to become an astronaut as a sideline. It normally has to be a main line. And in my case, I was originally taken by fantasy and science fiction and reading Jules Verne, well, really comic books first, and then Arthur C. Clarke and Jules Verne and Isaac Asimov and Ray Bradbury. and Edgar Rice Burroughs, reading all those adventure kind of stories. And then Star Trek, the original run, Star Trek with Kirk and Spock and McCoy. And that came on when I was a kid growing up on the farm. So we got to move the antenna bunny ears on the TV and watch Star Trek once a week. And then 2001, A Space Odyssey, that movie, the mashup between Stanley Kubrick and Arthur C. Clarke, incredible film. And all of those ideas, inspired by an artistic vision of the future that didn't exist, kind of planted the seed. But unlike the generations of kids before me, I was also in parallel watching actual space flight happen with Gagarin and then Al Shepard and then the Mercury Gemini and then the Apollo program. And the summer that I bought that guitar when I was 9 years old was the same summer that Buzz Aldrin and Neil Armstrong walked on the moon. And that crossover between fantasy and reality of human activity. And I thought, wow, if those guys can do it, then this isn't just fantasy. This is actually a career choice. This is a thing that you could do. So, of all the things that I might do when I grow up, why don't I do that? And I had no idea how to do it. But that's what really firmly put the bit in my teeth of that's what I want to do with my life. Even though, I'm Canadian, we didn't have NASA, we didn't have rocket ships. But I thought, well, it wasn't very long ago that the Americans didn't have NASA and rocket ships either. Things are going to change. And then obviously the huge onus of responsibility is going to be on me to change myself, to try and turn myself into someone like whatever, Mike Collins or Neil Armstrong, so that maybe someday someone will trust me to command a spaceship.
So was the Canadian Space Agency quite, I mean, active and was able to give you the path necessary for you to do it, or were, did you have to go down to the States and go through the NASA process?
Uh, when I decided to start turning myself into an astronaut, it was impossible. There was no route for a Canadian to be an astronaut. It wasn't hard. It was impossible. But I thought things are definitely going to change. And there's time. I'm only 10, so I'm not ready to go anyway. And so I worked and trained for 2 decades and went to multiple universities. And I looked at the original astronauts and thought, what do they know how to do? What have they got that I haven't got? What have they learned how to do? And number one, they were fit. So, okay, I'll keep myself fit. Fine, that's simple. And they knew how to operate really complicated things. I mean, Buzz Aldrin had a PhD out of MIT. So, like, okay, I'm going to have to go study technical things at university and some sort of engineering. That's what appealed to me most. And then you fly a spaceship. It's a verb. So okay, I need to learn how to fly. I don't have any money, but there's normally programs available in Canada. There's Air Cadets, where if you join up in the Air Cadets and you do well enough on the tests, then they'll teach you to fly for free. And before I had my driver's license, I had my pilot's license. I was flying airplanes before I was legal to drive on the road. And then I looked and I realized, well, a lot of them are test pilots. And in order to be a test pilot, you have to already be an extremely accomplished pilot and then go to test pilot school for a year. But I thought that all sounded fascinating anyway. And so I joined the Royal Canadian Air Force. I went through the military academies, did graduate school, and then also went through pilot training in addition to my air cadet training, and went through and became a fighter pilot and was a combat pilot in the Cold War, intercepting Soviet bombers. And then I went to test pilot school. I was selected. One Canadian a year goes to test pilot school. I was selected and went and trained with the U.S. Air Force at Edwards. And right around then, Canada formed a space agency. They didn't have one up until then, but they formed one in 1989 after a few years of government decision making. And then I worked as a test pilot, in fact, on exchange with the U.S. Navy. So I was a U.S. Navy test pilot as a Canadian because we both fly F-18s. And in 92, all of those qualifications came together, and the brand new 3-year-old Canadian Space Agency said, we want a crop of astronauts. And so they had a national selection. 5,330 people applied, and they hired 4 of us. And then I immediately got sent down along with one of the other Canadian astronauts to start training with the NASA astronaut corps. Uh, and so I was in Houston for 21 years as a member of the NASA astronaut corps, but as a Canadian from the Canadian Space Agency.
You went up to space. You came down. You started to write. I mean, you wrote a memoir of your experience, which isn't. It's not fiction. It's your actual testimonial of your experience. But then you start to get into fiction writing. Was the process of writing so positive that you decide to go beyond the writing about your experience? Because now you have the Apollo murders, and it's a pretty appropriate thriller. James Cameron says it's a nail biting thriller, and the premise of the book is between the Russians and the Americans on the moon. But was the writing for you so like another extension of that artist, of the musician in you, wanting to expand more than just telling your experience in space?
I always liked writing. I mean, language and writing was my favorite subject in school. I just thought that they're not going to let me fly in space if all I know how to do is write, because I'll crash the spaceship. So, but I've always enjoyed writing, and I think everyone should attempt to be good at using their own native language. It just seems logical. Um, and the first book, the one you mentioned, "Astronaut's Guide to Life on Earth," it's really not a memoir. It's exactly what the title says. It's an astronaut's guide to life on Earth. It's very much ideas of how to live a better life. Because after 30 years, all the various things I've done, I thought some of the lessons might be helpful to everybody. And it's pretends to be a memoir, follows sort of a career, but that actually it's just a book of ideas. But then I thought it would be, rather than trying to just tell the factual story, you have a lot more freedom to get into people's visceral reaction and how everybody actually behaves. What does it make you feel like, and what does it make other people feel like? And that's where fiction gives you so much more freedom. It's like the difference between writing a march, which is complex, John Philip Sousa and those great songs, or writing, a really interesting folk song or some sort of ballad or some sort of power chord rock something. And so I thought I would challenge myself to write a thriller fiction book. And so I decided to write alternative history thriller fiction. I wrote The Apollo Murders. And maybe you don't know, Daniel, but just right now we're signing with a British production company to turn it into an 8-part TV series. And I'm not sure who's going to pick it up, or Apple or somebody like that. But that's pretty amazing to me that something that I invented and sat actually in this room at this desk and created out of my own head now has a pretty good shot of getting on millions of screens all around the world. But what I really like about it is talking to people after they've read it and discussing why characters did things, and how did this arc of story actually happen, and what was real and what wasn't real. And it's one more way to kind of open up your own head, and let other people in on what's going on inside. And I learned a lot too. So I'm currently writing the next book in the series. It'll be the 5th book that I've written, but the follow-on to the Apollo Murders. I'm about halfway through writing it right now.
Can you share with us a little bit of your creative process? Is that something that I've written the piece in my book Feel the Wild about waiting, because during my solo wilderness expeditions, when you do photography, often you wait for hours, and then the minute that you look away, this is the moment that the shot happens, and then you have to wait again. And how some artists train themselves for that creative output to come out. It's a more something that every day they wake up, and some others really they just they only do it when it comes to them. Are you? Where are you in the spectrum of the creative process? Trained creativity, or whenever it comes to you?
Well, I do a lot more than write, of course, just like you do, and I help run some space companies, and I teach, and I make television series, and I run a big technology incubator. There's a lot of stuff filling my plate. And what I've found is, if I want to actually be creative, then I have to get some mental room. I need to not have the pressing issues of the day weighing on my psyche or my thought processes. So the way that I found best to do that is, number one, have a quiet place like this one. I'm actually in a cabin on an island. This cabin was built in 1896, and although we have internet now, and and I try and get my work all done in the afternoon and the evening. And then I wake up early, exercise first thing, and then sit at this desk. And then if there's some things cropped up overnight that have to be done, deal with them, get those things done, and then clear everything away. And then give myself the objective now of trying to write 1,000 words and spend the whole morning do it. Try and open up the whole morning till a late lunch or whatever to do my best to try and write 1,000 words. Because that's what other authors. I didn't make any of this up. I read Stephen King's book on writing, and I watched part of James Patterson's master class, and I looked online, and I read a lot of really really good thriller fiction, and from all of that, I sort of pieced together how I want to do it. But then the real process, Daniel, is I sit here and I review what I wrote the last couple of days, so I remember where the story is and what people were up to. And then I think, what would they do next? And sometimes your character surprises you, or a new character pops up, that you thought was going to be a bit part, and you realize, holy cow, this person's taken over the story, but that's okay. And then you start writing, and you realize, oh, I don't know that. What is the capital of Ohio? Dang. And so there's I do constant research the whole time I'm writing, looking up spelling, looking up punctuation, looking up facts, and then maybe looking up room, for the story. But it's all within the framework of something I've already considered. I've thought about the big picture of how this story ought to go, and it has to be possible, and a reasonable story arc. It's got to have room for excitement and surprise. There have to be the characters in it that I have some rough idea of who they are and how it's going to interplay, and I know sort of how I want it to end up. And once I'm convinced, it's as if you gathered a whole bunch of threads and said, okay, now I'm going to make a carpet. If you don't have enough thread and enough colors, you're like, well, I'm not going to be able to make a carpet. I got to get more thread. And so initially, I do a lot of research and thread gathering to try and make sure that I'm going to be able to weave it all together. But then the mechanics of it, get up, exercise, clear the plate, and then sit down and just start writing. I think it was Ray Bradbury who said, nobody can write 500 bad short stories. If you want to be a writer, you just got to write, and you're going to learn and get better at it as you go. And I agree with him. You just got to write.
You just got to do and trust yourself in the process of whether it's music, being a musician, or I mean, whatever you do. I think that's one of the amazing um, thing about the human species is we don't always know what to do, but we figure a way to get better and better, and we fail, but then we get back up, and every time we find ourselves, like I know that still the writing process, there's always a time that I look at that blank page and I'm like, it's not coming, and then I start to get a little bit nervous. But because I've learned to stick with it, I know that there's a moment, there's going to be that little switch, and then it starts. And then that, like, okay, now I'm going to be resourceful. I know how to find these answers that I'm looking for so that you can move forward.
And some days suddenly you've written 1,500 or 1,600 words. I have a sort of a thing that just illustrates what you just said. When you're living on a spaceship, your psychological support crew tries to get interesting people for you to talk to once every few weeks. And one of the people they got to talk to me was Neil Young, the musician. And so they said, "Hey, Neil Young's going to give you a call tomorrow," which is pretty exciting. He's written some legendary stuff, and some of the first music I ever learned on guitar was to play, "Heart of Gold" or something by Neil. Um, and and so I was talking to Neil, but two things that he told me I think are really relevant to what you just said. And one was, in all of the music that he's written, he said, "I don't write music; I just write music down." And what he meant was, I don't, there's nothing highfalutin about it. It's not fancy. It's like, today I'm going to write a song. Instead, it is, hey, that's a cool idea. Let me write that down. Huh. Hey, oh yeah. And what he recognizing that it's just a creative process. When the mood strikes you or when you get the idea, write it down. Don't give yourself some great burden of being a music writer. Just don't write music, just write music down. The other thing he said, which I think helps illustrate that, is don't judge your artistic creation until you finished it. Because if you judge every word or every phrase or every rhyme or every sentence, then you're gonna agonize over it so much that you'll talk yourself out of completing it. um, and wait until you finish the song or the whatever, the chapter, and then go back and edit it. And who know? And I mean, Neil Young wrote some real clunkers. He wrote some songs that are terrible, but he wrote some songs that are brilliant. But I think what's really key out of that is the creative process. You just have to get it flowing. You need to write it down, and you need to defer judgment until you've got this creativity complete, and then you can go back and sculpt it a little bit more. And he was talking specifically with me about music at the time, but I have really taken that advice to heart in writing books also. I think, and if I was a sculptor or a painter, I think I would listen to those words just as carefully.
I was recently having a conversation about the difference between artists and content creators, because often we confuse the two. And I think the content creators will also most of the time they create with the intent of the public already in mind. They're having the public lead their creation. What am I doing that can please them or I can generate the likes? The artist, they create to find answers or actually to lead the public to certain places. It's them not doing it with the hope of getting accolades or getting likes, but really to be more on the fringes or to give an experience for the public and elevate them rather than just the other one where it's the public before. What do you think?
Well, when I write music on guitar, and I wrote and recorded a whole album, in fact, while I was on the space station, called Space Sessions, Songs from a Tin Can.
Correct.
Um, uh, the guitar often comes up with the music for me. I'm just, noodling or playing or fiddling around. My hands are playing something they knew. And then there's some little hammer on or lick or chord change. And I go, wow, that's different. That's not something I'm used to hearing. And then I'll just pursue that and develop that. And then I'll be grabbing a piece of paper and writing down that chord sequence. Oh, what words would go with that? And that it's just pure uh, sort of associative inspiration, where the guitar becomes an extension of yourself to allow you to, imagine if you could move your fingers and harp music played or something. It allows you to extend beyond yourself to then maybe create something that otherwise you'd be incapable of. And so I love the spontaneity of that. And some days, just like Neil said, hey, you can't write a song today. Just not going to happen. There's nothing going on, or your spark is all used up. But some days it's just there, and your hands were ready to show you something different. And when that happens, it's really nice. But as you say, when you get to the end, you may go, oh, that's lovely and pretty. And then you play it for someone else, and they go, meh. I go, oh well, that's okay. I created something and I like it, and maybe it'll work into something later. But then you might play it for someone else, and they go, wow, that's really cool. And why don't you go to the D minor seventh instead? And it can really evolve into something. And to me, that's the real fun part, when not only have you done something that you're proud of and that you like, but that then other people can share in, or maybe even contribute to.
Absolutely. There's a magic in that moment when you realize that there's something more that came out of thin air and just connects people. Chris, what is back to your book, your latest book, which is a series, and well, I can't wait to see it on the screen. So, what is the premise? Because a lot of it is actually kind of almost timely. what's happening with some of the relationship, but it involves the Americans and the Russians and being on the moon. It's a thriller. Can you explain a little bit more? What's the storyline of the book?
Yeah, it's alternative history fiction. So it is set in 1973, actually, in the spring of 73. And if you think about what was going on then, it was the end of the Apollo program. So Apollo 17 had gone. It was the Nixon administration coming apart, with Watergate. And it was in the fall of 73 that he said, "I am not a crook," and so his legacy, all of that was in the news. It was the end of the Vietnam War. It was the Cold War between the United States and the Soviet Union that was going on, and so there was all of that conflict, and there were some things happening in space that nobody knows about. At the time, the Soviets had a spy space station with people on board that had a huge telescope inside to be able to do spy work down on the surface, and it was armed. It had a machine gun mounted to the outside. They called that space station Almaz, which means diamond, and that was real. And they had a rover driving around on the moon called Lunokhod, and so that was an interesting framework for my story. And then there was an Apollo 18 and Apollo 19, but because of budgetary restrictions and fear of another Apollo 13, Nixon canceled those two missions. But the rockets were built. And so for my story, I had Apollo 18 actually fly, and he got the money for Apollo 18 from the U.S. Air Force, which is how they financed the shuttle. So it's not a far fetched story. And then that makes the purpose of the mission a little more military than it would have been otherwise. And so the story follows the thread of the cruise and Apollo 18, and includes the Almaz Soviet space station, and then all the way to the surface of the moon. And um, and and then the story comes right around to the big climax, of course, splashing down just north of Hawaii. So it's a big rollicking tale with cosmonauts and astronauts and space stations and machine guns and all. But I'm really delighted. It's already in 14 languages, I think, or going into 14 languages, and I just love the reaction worldwide. And pretty lucky as a first time author, because I think someone told me there are a million books published every year. So to get lots of people reading a book is a difficult thing to do. So I'm really pleased that a lot of people are enjoying reading the Apollo Murders. This is Henry. Henry is he's a puppy. He's 9 months old, so he just decided he was feeling a little bit lonely. So he wanted up in my lap. But anyway, this is Henry. He's a good boy, and we'll have to go for a walk after you and I talk.
Absolutely. Did you always have dogs in your life?
Yeah, I grew up on a farm, and we always had dogs. And then my wife and I, we've had dogs since before we got married. We got our first dog before we got married. So yeah, we've always had dogs, and I think dogs are, they're a natural companion for people, and they're very attuned to human emotions and good companions and fun. So yeah, we've had multiple types and sizes and dogs over the years, but Henry is the current dog, and he's Henry is a very good dog.
I When I married my wife 6 years ago, she came with her own dog. It was a little Maltese Bichon, and if you had told me in my bachelor days that I would be the type of guy who would give presentation with a white dog in a backpack, I would have said, no, 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 this is not me. And I ended up being the solo wilderness explorer on stage giving presentation with a little white dog in the backpack. Unfortunately, Kobe passed away 18 months ago. But I definitely
Uh,
can concur with you how they really open your heart. I mean, they are just these creatures that if you take care of them, you have unconditional love, and I think it's one of the best ways to open your heart.
Yeah, I can just see however many tens of thousands of years ago of some little group of humans, and they were getting peril or attacked by wolves, and maybe killed the parents and then had the puppies. And all it took was one sort of earnest, needing look from a puppy, and you can just imagine, like, well, maybe we could take care of it for a minute or a day or a week, and a dog raised, in a human environment gets a different set of priorities. So I don't think it took very long at all to start domesticating dogs, and now, of course, with a variety of breeds, it's incredible. But yeah, I'm very glad that there have always been dogs in my life.
Does he travel with you, or
He did today, yeah, and yeah, he's small enough to fit under the seat, so he does. He travels where we go. Yes, and it's I like. I took my granddaughter to a big natural history museum on the weekend, and it's a really healthy thing to do because you see the world through a fresh set of eyes. And a dog notices things that you sure don't know, and they have different values and different priorities than you do. And so sometimes it's good to try and pay attention to what is the dog actually looking at? What are they noticing? What are they hearing or smelling that I'm either ignoring or incapable of hearing or smelling? Because they're having maybe not a richer experience, but they're having a different experience than you are. And the same thing when you take a child to a museum, they see it differently, and different things are important. And I think it's almost like having another sense
Yep.
of being able to absorb what's happening around you, to have a pet or a child or something there to help you experience what's happening.
I remember reading about this a book about dogs. It was this author who has done a tremendous amount of research, and she said something that really changed my understanding of that perspective. Is that while we are a species that is based on sight, we see things, we see the change, we see the people. Dogs experience that the time through smell. Time has a different smell. Something that is young doesn't smell the same thing as something that is middle age and something that is older. So it's less visual, but it's really through the smell that they get to experience time and all these other things of us. It's is based on science. So it's really a different experience of the world.
Yeah, they definitely experience the world differently. I agree, and but that's a cool thought. I hadn't really thought of the fact that they can smell the age of things and therefore understand it in a different way than we do. But yeah, it makes complete sense.
Chris, before we get to the conclusion, I just want to briefly get your opinion on space. At the beginning was a more of a dividing field. Different countries that were competing for it. And then it became a unifying narrative. The space station as this place of collaboration. When I was talking to Scott Berzinski, he told me that one of his three words was collaborative. Just the idea that these people from different nations went over there with the intent of working together. But now, as the space is reopening and being more accessible to people, do you think that there's we're going to need a lot of work and diplomacy to keep that collaborative and not finding as the space becomes more dividing rather than unifying?
Well, everything goes in cycles, and uh, political cycles, weather cycles, your own natural yearly or daily cycle, or the cycle of your entire life. So there's no reason to think that space exploration and development is going to be any different than all the other human endeavors. But I think it's been a terrific example of shared challenge and therefore cooperation. The enemy of my enemy, by definition, is my friend, right? In this case, we have a common enemy, and that is the complexity and the danger of space itself. And therefore, in order to overcome it, it takes cooperation. No single person's getting to space. No small group of people. It's going to take a big team, and in a lot of cases, the team is a lot stronger if they're not just in one small location or one particular political group, but if they're international. And that's really proven itself during the Mir program and during the International Space Station program. We saved each other's bacon multiple times after the Columbia accident, after the Soyuz accident. All There were always periods where each individual of the 15 partners was having a serious problem, and the other ones could carry the burden for a while. So, and that's not going to stop. But there's always going to be times where there's conflict, or one of the nations is going through something that is is undesirable. Um, but it's going to go in fits and starts. But even if it's only one step back and then a couple forward, you're still starting to move forwards. And we also maybe perhaps lose a little bit of understanding of just how quickly this has happened. When I was born, no one had flown in space. All of human space travel has happened in less than my lifetime. It's happening incredibly fast. We've gone from impossible to international team from 15 countries living and working peacefully together for 2 decades in space, just so quickly. And we're on the cusp right now of settling the moon and figuring out how to go even further. And our robots are all over the place. So to me, it's going amazingly fast, and we're doing it even though there are international objectives and occasional international conflicts. So yeah, it's never been easy. um, it sort of flies in the face of history, maybe even flies in the face of common sense, but it flies. And to me, that's the really cool and fascinating part of it, and what's still continuing today, and the part that I've worked hard to continue, but also the part that continues to inspire me.
Absolutely. Now you're going to go and walk the dog. Where can people find? I mean, your book is on Amazon, Indigo, and all the places
It's
everywhere.
everywhere. So it's anywhere you can buy a book. Yeah, if you just Google it, it's there. Hey, shh, shh, quiet, Henry. It's Yeah, it's everywhere. And actually, the audio version of it is the guy who did it. His name is Ray Porter. He's a superb actor, and he did a terrific job of reading the Apollo murders, for so people can just listen to it if they don't have time to sit and read it. So yeah, it's everywhere, and it's coming in more and more languages. A new language every month or something. So no matter what language you'd like to read it in, hopefully we'll get it there fairly soon.
Well, Chris, thank you so much for your time. I really appreciate it. And I look forward that our path will cross now that people are traveling again in some of the space events or even on a creative circuit. I'm pretty sure that you and I will meet face to face. Thank you very much.
I look forward to it. I really enjoyed the conversation, Daniel, even just a virtual face to face. But it's a small planet. I've been around it 2,600 times. I'm sure we'll bump into each other somewhere.
Absolutely. All right.
Be well.